Welcome. My name is Tania Munz, and I'm the Vice President for Scholarly Programs here at the Center. The National Humanities Center is observing its 40th anniversary this year. To celebrate, we've organized a number of special events highlighting the value of the humanities in all of our lives, here in the Triangle and in cities across the country. This evening's gathering is one of those events. It's my distinct pleasure to act as a facilitator for this conversation between two of this year's wonderful fellows, Tera Hunter and Andreá Williams. After our conversation, we'll open the floor to your questions, followed by a reception with tonight's speakers. I'm getting a bit of feedback. So please join us for that as well. Before we get started, I'd also like to acknowledge two of our institutional sponsors, the Research Triangle Institute and TUCASI, the Triangle University Centers for Advanced Study Incorporated. Their support has made this year-long celebration possible, and we're grateful to them. This evening's event underscores one of the most important aspects of the Center's scholarly mission. Not only to bring together some of the best humanists from around the world and across disciplines to focus on their research away from the demands and distractions of their regular settings, but also to enable them to form an intellectual community here at the Center. Every year, when fellows arrive for their fellowships, they discover others who share their interests, scholars whose work intersects with their own areas of research in interesting and sometimes unexpected ways. This year, we're fortunate to have two scholars whose projects explore the subject of marriage and singleness among African Americans in very different ways. But before we begin and get into the heart of the discussion, I'd like to introduce them to you. Tera Hunter is Professor of History and African American Studies at Princeton University. She's a scholar of labor, gender, race, and Southern history from early America to the present, and has published widely on these subjects. Her book, Bound in Wedlock, Slave and Free Marriage in the 19th Century, came out last year with Belknap Press of Harvard University Press and was a finalist for the Lincoln Prize. Her previous book, To Joy My Freedom, Southern Black Women's Lives and Labors After the Civil War, was published with Harvard University Press in 1997. The books received several awards, including the H.L. Mitchell Award from the Southern Historical Association, the Letitia Brown Memorial Book Prize from the Association of Black Women's Historians, and the Book of the Year Award from the International Labor History Association. Professor Hunter has written for and talked to audiences also that reach well beyond the academy. She's written pieces in the New York Times for the WashingtonPost.com, ChristianScienceMonitor.com, and Ebony.com, and has been interviewed by National Public Radio about her work. She holds a BA from Duke University and an MPhil and PhD from Yale University. This year, she's working on her project, The African American Marriage Gap in the 20th Century, as the Center's Birkeland Fellow. Welcome, Tera. Andreá Williams is an associate professor of English at The Ohio State University. She specializes in African American and 19th century American literature. As a literary historian, Professor Williams is especially drawn to questions about the social and material conditions that historically have enabled or inhibited the production of art by African Americans. Her research focused on autobiographical writing, African American newspapers, magazines, and print culture, as well as Black feminist literature and theory. She's a co-editor of the collection North Carolina Slave Narratives, and her book Dividing Lines, Class Anxiety and Post-Bellum Black Fiction came out in 2013 with the University of Michigan Press. The book examines how Black writers in the late 19th century represented class differences within Black communities while projecting a collective front of racial solidarity against white racism. Professor Williams earned her undergraduate degree from Spelman College and her MA and PhD degrees from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. This year, she is an ACLS Frederick Borchardt Fellow at the National Humanities Center and is working on a cultural study of the status of singleness and the literature and lifestyles of unmarried African American women in the early 20th century. Her book project is titled Unmarried Misfits, Single Women and 20th Century Black Culture. Please join me in welcoming Andreá Williams. Thanks to both of you for joining us, and thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. Tera, I'd like to start with you. In your book, Bound in Wedlock, you cover vast ground to explore marriage among people of African descent in the 19th century, under slavery, during the Civil War, during Reconstruction, and up to the turn of the 20th century. And now you're tackling a no less ambitious project of African American marriage in the 20th century. But before we jump into the 20th century, where your work and Andrea's meet, could you tell us a bit about what you learned about African American marriage in the 19th century that led you to your current project?
First of all, thank you for this opportunity. Thank you all for coming out. It's been a wonderful year to be here, and to have colleagues like Andrea has been especially special, but all the colleagues here have been really wonderful. You never know who you're going to end up with, and it's been really great to have such great people while I'm on leave this year. So in terms of the book that I just wrote on African American marriage, I got interested in the topic because of the work that I was doing in the archives, specifically during the period of Reconstruction, looking at documents related to African American families. And what really struck me in those records was kind of a very rich emotional texture of their lives, which the historical literature had not really captured. And I was especially interested in marriage because marriage is foundational in American life. And so that's what led me to the topic of looking specifically at marriage and deciding to look not just in Reconstruction, but at the entire 19th century. Marriage and race are closely correlated. We don't think of the history of marriage as being defined by race, but it's been defined by race since the very beginning of colonial America. So one of the very first laws that was passed in colonial Virginia, in colonial America in general, was in 1643. It was a law basically that defined a woman's labor, an African woman's labor as tithable, meaning that her husband, if she were married or if she were single, she had to pay a tax on agricultural labor. And so what was important about that law is that it separated African from European women. And so that law also impaired the ability of African Americans to marry. It made it harder because you had to pay a tax on women's labor when labor was normally taxed for men and not for women. So that's the first sign that we get of marriage being racially defined. And so in the book, I talk about how marriage is not legally recognized under slavery, and largely because it helps to perpetuate slaves as permanent servants. And so it also protects the property rights of slave owners. So again, marriage is marked by race. So being interested in that notion of racial inequality is what really sort of guided my interest in the 19th century, and it continues into the 20th century because even once African Americans achieved marital rights, they gained legal rights basically during the period of the Civil War, and after the Civil War ends, marriage continues to be defined by race in terms of, first of all, many of the laws that were passed legalizing slave marriages actually included provisions to punish them if they failed to register their relationships, if they committed infractions such as adultery or desertion. So that theme continues. And so by the time we get to the 20th century, my book ends around 1899, 1900. By the time we get to that point, marriage has come a long way. And so what's really striking is that by that point, marriage is nearly universal among African Americans. And so that's what has generated my interest in the 20th century, to look at what's happening between 1900 and 2000, roughly speaking, when something shifts, things begin to change, and African Americans marriage rates start to decline among African Americans.
And that's the myth you point to as well, right? That around the turn of the century, African American and white marriage rates were roughly equal, but there's a pervasive myth that you write about that both liberals and conservatives hold, that marriage rates among African Americans are low because of slavery.
Right, and so the book is also interested in debates about contemporary issues that infringe upon historical ideas. And so some scholars, some policymakers have made an argument that The reason that marriages have declined among African Americans is because of slavery. And I dispute that in the book. I argue that that's really not the case. And I don't know if you want me to now just sort of spell out that argument. So by 1900, African Americans are nearly universally married. The patterns begin to change, however, around mid-century. So starting around the 1940s, roughly speaking, marriage rates start to diverge. White marriage rates start to go up slightly, and partly that's a product of the GI Bill. So the GI Bill is very formative in the creation of the what we call the middle class. It provides benefits for mostly white veterans because of racial discrimination in terms of loans for education, mortgages, job training, all kinds of resources. African American men don't have access to those resources. And the program is partly designed to boost marriage rates. There's a concern about what's going to happen with those men who are returning from the war. And so the GI Bill really kicks in, and marriage rates start to go up for white Americans. At the same time, something dramatic happens that's never happened before in American life, and that's African Americans who've always been workers are being kicked out of the economy permanently. So the rate of permanent unemployment starts to go up, starting in the 1940s, and it's gone up every decade ever since. So you have these negative economic pressures on African Americans. You have the permanent unemployment, then you have underemployment in terms of people not getting, decent jobs. They're not being paid very well, or they're being employed for only a limited number of hours. And then you have high mortality rates among, sort of men in that age cohort where men and women normally get married, and of course, mass incarceration. So the mortality rates and the mass incarceration rates are driving the numbers down. And so what you have is a kind of skewed sex ratio, more women than men in many contexts. All of these factors combined and others are basically contributing to the racial gap that emerges in marriage. How does slavery fit into that? Slavery has nothing to do with those, mid to late 20th century phenomenon that are impinging on marriage rates. So those who argue that are trying to make a cultural argument. They're basically saying that there's something innate about Black culture that is shaping their decisions to marry, as opposed to there are all of these things that are actually creating pressure on African Americans that are discouraging them from marrying.
Thank you. Okay, Andreá, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. You also talk about the first half of the 20th century, and in some ways you push up against the focus on marriage. Talk to us a little bit about how you came to your project on singleness in the first half of the 20th century.
Okay, great. And thanks again to all of you for joining us today. This project has had a lot of input from people both in this room and externally, great archives here in North Carolina for studying single women, and I'll be able to talk about those a little bit later. But this book has had several beginnings, not yet an ending. And one of those, though, for me was recognizing that in my earlier work, many of the African American women writers about whom I wrote were single for either all of their lives or the greater part of their lives. And I wondered if it was more than coincidental, if there was something about the experience of being single that either enabled or motivated these women towards their authorship and their activism. At the same time, I was teaching a class in American literature to 1900 that has a tradition, especially in the late 19th century, of white women's literature that focuses on spinsters, such as a story that I love to teach called A New England Nun, in which a woman has a chance to get married, but she has been living independently for so long that when her fiance comes back, he's like knocking over her teacup and she's saying, I prefer to live alone. Actually, I like this, okay? And so the last part of that story is to say that she lived like an uncloistered nun. And my students are like, this is a horrible story. And I'm like, I love this story, right? But again, it was a story about a white American woman. And so I said, I know that there are a lot of Black female writers. Are they writing stories about Black New England nuns? Maybe not so, but they are writing in some cases about Black single women. And so I wanted to think more about that kind of connection there. I'd say additionally, though, for however much my work focuses on the 19th century, that I'm certainly surrounded by 20th and 21st century concerns. So the same time that I'm teaching my 19th century American class, I'm seeing headlines like, does the Black church keep Black women single? Or is marriage for white people? And so I started to think again about, are there some connections between this apparent angst about the status of single women in the 19th century and the 20th century? Again, not to draw connections of causation, but rather to think about how those justifications for singleness and marriage continue or shift over time. So part of my work has been motivated particularly by trying to think, is there something about the lifestyle of singleness that both is a threat or perceived as a threat to some people and yet allows so many women to be able to mobilize their careers?
Great. You mentioned North Carolina and being here. I'd like to ask both of you to talk a little bit about the sources that you're using for your scholarship and what kinds of things you're discovering in them.
So for me, so I just wrote the book on the 19th century. I can talk way more about that. I use all kinds of sources, and I was drowning in sources. That was one of my biggest challenges, which was a challenge because the book that I'd written previously, To Joy My Freedom, had the opposite problem, where I had scarce sources. So I was accustomed to scarcity. I was not accustomed to having abundant sources. So I was totally thrown off by that. So I use a variety of sources, sort of slave autobiographies, lots of personal narratives and letters, public records, church records, government documents. Legal sources are especially significant in the work, much more so than I had expected. And they're quite interesting because on the one hand, they're sources about the law, they're about specific legal cases, but they're also, what I discovered is they also have narratives about people's lives. And so they serve multiple purposes. So I was, basically I had a very rich repository of lots of stories that came through a variety of sources that I wasn't quite expecting to find stories in. For the 20th century, I'm finding that I'm going to have to deal more with quantitative sources. So the census is going to be really important, which I deal with a little bit at the end of the book in the 19th century. But part of the challenge for this book is to think more from a bird's eye view as opposed to the ground level. And as historians, we're trained to really focus more on the ground. And so partly, I don't want to spend another 15 years writing another book. So I'm, trying to find ways of talking about the 20th century without going into the great detail that I talked about with respect to the 19th century. I'm also not my work has been mostly about the 19th century and, up through the early part of the 20th century. So the deeper we get into the 20th century, the more I feel less comfortable anyway. So some of the sources, more legal sources, African-American periodicals become more important, and I think this is one area that Andrea's work and my work connects in terms of some of the sources that we're finding in Black newspapers and Black periodicals where, there's a discussion going on about what it means to be married, or why don't people, why aren't people marrying more, or what does it mean to be single? So Black periodicals are really important, newspapers, lots of ethnographic studies as well, thinking about Du Bois's work, for example, the Philadelphia Negro, his study on the Black family that was done around 1908, all of the studies that he edited on Atlanta University. So lots of different kinds of sources.
Tara is right in mentioning that there's a great overlap in terms of how we both think about periodicals. I especially like to look at Black edited magazines and newspapers, thinking not only about what they can tell me about the social life, like who was throwing a party, the kind of bachelor girl clubs that are hosting a gala. That's very important for me to know. Bachelor girl being another one of those words before bachelorette, as we might see as a contemporary TV show or something. I think also, though, those newspapers give me serialized fiction. So I look at both fiction and nonfiction, and by serialized, I mean that a story unfolds chapter by chapter over multiple weeks to really draw in an audience over time. So those are some of the ways that I look. I'm also interested in published novels. I've been looking at a few sets of letters, and for a number of reasons, North Carolina has been really rich for me. One is because Bennett College in Greensboro is one of two remaining single-sex Black women's colleges. The other is Spelman College. And so they have great archives for me to know how they were training young women, either for careers and marriage or careers or marriage. And especially in looking at the records of institutions like colleges, lodges, lodging homes, settlement homes, college dormitories, and so on. I've been interested in how those organizations often had their own print cultures or performance culture. And so the records of North Carolina Mutual Insurance Company, the large African-American owned insurance company headquartered here in Durham, actually has newspapers and magazines that they made in-house. One I just was looking at yesterday at Duke was called the Fifth Floor Gazette, because that's where all of the female stenographers lived. And so, or rather worked, but the connection to lived too is that there was a clerk's home, an area of next door to one of the owner's houses that they set up as living quarters for single Black women to be able to live together as they worked for North Carolina Mutual. So that was a beautiful find for me to be able to think through some of those issues.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, talk to us a little bit more about what these women's lives were like and what their experiences were like.
Sure. Throughout the project, I look at both, as I mentioned, fictional and actual historical figures, and I've been particularly drawn to the kind of biographies of writers, editors, educators, reformers, and so on. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the women who really drew my attention to this project, one of my many beginnings, as I mentioned before, was Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And Harper was a temperance lecturer and abolitionist, and also worked in favor of women's rights. And she married late at 35, even though I would come back later and trouble that language of late, because it assumes that there is a proper time by which we should marry. But she married at 35 and only remained married for 3 years before she was widowed. She lives for 40 plus years after this. So if you do the math, I think she's unmarried for the majority of her life. And what does that mean about the fact that she publishes some of the early Black short stories, thinking about that as a new genre, that she's publishing multiple serialized fictions, that she's giving dozens of talks within 1 month, traveling from one location to another. And so someone like her really draws my attention. I then end up looking at women across the spectrum of what we might consider single, so widowed as well as separated or divorced, as well as those who were never married, or as I prefer to say, ever single. And one of the things that I note about those women is that their lives were often drawn towards community service, that whether or not it was their choice to be single, they actually used some of the flexibility of not caring for an immediate family, although some did, to be able to travel. And so as I look at their personal lives, I see a good bit of travel. I see public speaking events. I see institution building, with them building lodging houses churches and colleges or schools from the ground. And I see an intense focus on friendships and relationships with other women as well. So they really did think about their personal lives as being single as having some kind of public implications of giving them additional time or resources to be able to work for the good of others.
That's great. Both of you treat marriage or marital status through multiple lenses. On the one hand, you talk about it as a private matter, and I think one thing that's so rich in your book, Tera, Bound in Wedlock, is that there's these incredibly rich personal stories that come out of the legal sources that you look at. Mm-hmm. But of course, marriage isn't just between, and we can talk about heteronormativity later, but being between a man and a woman, it's also an institution, right? And it's a political institution, it's a legal institution, a social institution. Talk to us a little bit about how you navigate this relationship between the personal and the more structural.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, under slavery, there is no privacy. So African-American marriages are subject to being contravened in lots of different ways. Sexually violated, couples are separated, they have no control of their children. So the private versus public is very troubled with respect to the slavery period. But marriage, there are lots of people who have an interest in marriage, aside from the couple. And so there's a community interest in marriage, even among African Americans who are enslaved. And so you see families and communities taking an interest in whether people decide to marry or not, using their kind of authority to sort of encourage people to marry. And so when missionaries come down, white northern missionaries start to come down during the Civil War period. And so one of the things that they're very interested in almost immediately is marrying people, sort of formalizing the relationships that had been created under slavery. But they rub up against a lot of often pushback. And what they discover is that they have to actually go to the elders in the community to actually get anywhere. And so that tells you something about the role that communities play in sort of helping couples to negotiate their intimate relationships. So there's a kind of interest beyond the individual couples. And there's also an interest that the state takes in these relationships as well. And so that's also really important in terms of thinking about the role that the states play. And so there is a state interest, for example, even in informal marriages. So marriages for slaves are informal because they can't legalize those relationships. But I think people don't realize how much most white people actually did not legalize their relationships either. It really, especially in the South, it's really not until the postbellum period that whites start to formalize their relationships. And so there's this long period of informal marriages, much longer in the South than in the North. It happens sooner in the North. But what's interesting is how the state regards white informal relationships versus Black informal relationships. So white informal relationships are treated as though they're legal. There's a certain amount of respect that's accorded to those relationships. Whereas African Americans, first of all, again, they don't have, their privacy is not respected. They're not inviolable unions. They can be separated at any time. But what's even more interesting is what happens once the Civil War is over and then marriages become legalized. African Americans adopt a number of different kinds of relationships. They adopt legal relationships mostly, but they also continue to maintain their informal relationships. And so what's interesting then is how they continue to still not compare to the white informal relationships that are also persisting. So there was a way in which they were described as sort of imitating marriage, acting as though they are married. And for whites, that's seen as a sign of respect for the institution, but for African Americans, it's seen as a failure. It's like you're immoral, you're not living up, you're kind of playing at it, but you're not really fully living up to the established or the sanctioned form. So those are some of the ways private and public become factors.
Mm-hmm. I'd agree with that and really build on the ways that in the field of literature that writers and critics in particular have noted that because marriage in a public forum seemed to reflect on the individual worth or individual lives and respectability of African Americans, that Black women in particular venerated marriage as a kind of sign of freedom or of respect. And so scholars have talked about how the emphasis on the romance form, for example, led to a kind of coupling convention, that we very much see the end of a lot of African American literature end in marriage, not simply because those people venerate love, but because they think that to show forth happy homes is evidence of Black Americans' respectability and their fittedness for the rights of citizenship. So you want to be able to vote, show us that you know how to control your households, show us that you know how to marry and to raise respectable children. The challenge with the interpretation of thinking of marriage as a kind of sign of freedom or agency alone is that it leads to a possible implicit kind of reading of singleness as failure, as you're noting there, or any non-marital relationship as failure or loss, rather than thinking about the other kinds of contributions and the many different kinds of permutations that happen among African Americans.
And so I'd like to pick up on that. When we talk about marriage, African American marriage in the 20th century, I'd be remiss not to bring up the Moynihan Report. Talk to us a little bit about what the Moynihan Report said and what its legacies have been for how African American marriages were scrutinized and have been and continue to be scrutinized.
So the Moynihan Report was, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who at the time was the Assistant Secretary or an Assistant Secretary of Labor under President Lyndon Johnson. He wrote a report sort of dealing with sort of the Negro problem. So what should we do with, what's the next steps in terms of dealing with the problem of Black people in America? And he wrote this memo that was sort of considered, it was initially considered to be an internal memo, but it was leaked to the press. And that's how it became sort of exposed and became very controversial. But in the report, he talks about basically African Americans under slavery, that under slavery, African American marriages were not respected, that there were basically matriarchies in the slavery period, that marriages were destroyed, that families were destroyed. So this notion of marriages under slavery having an impact on marriages in the late 20th century, we can trace back to Moynihan. But to be fair to Moynihan, we can trace it back to Du Bois and to E. Franklin Frazier, because that's where he actually got it from. But the gist of the report, even though Moynihan talked about the problems of racism in America, all the ways that African Americans have been harmed by slavery, by Jim Crow, all the kind of inequities that had created problems for African Americans, he focuses attention primarily on the family as the cause of all of the ills that were happening in America. Crime, unemployment, everything was sort of laid at the feet of the family and of and the blame was placed especially on Black women. This notion of there was a kind of absence of the patriarchy that was ruling these female-headed households. And so that report created a dialogue about Black families that tied the problems of African Americans in society in general to the family, to female-headed households in particular. And it's sort of received a new life in the last 10 years. Sociologists especially have pointed to the report as basically Moynihan, some are arguing that basically Moynihan was right. So if you look at the data in 1965 when he wrote the report, about 25% of African American children were in female-headed households. Today, that number is around 72%. And so people sort of point to that trajectory to say, well, look, Moynihan was actually right. And they also try to then give more credit to him for the kind of structural, his acknowledgement of the kind of structural constraints that were operating. But the problem is that it actually has taken, the way people have used that argument is to take away attention from the structural arguments and to focus on individual behaviors and to see marriage as basically a cure for poverty, which essentially it all the data suggests that's not true. So it's had a lasting influence in the way we think about public policy related to family. Welfare policy especially has been influenced by the Moynihan Report.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll open it up for discussion. And I want to stay with sort of more recent accounts. And we have talked about women and kind of the scrutiny of women through the Moynihan Report, or maybe as a legacy of the Moynihan Report as well. But in general, a recent study was published in the New York Times that it followed millions of children across generations, and it talked about African-American men and how they're doing. And I'm quoting a write-up from the New York Times. They did an extensive write-up of this study, and it was a study done by sociologists, right? It was political scientists and economists who were doing this study. To quote the study, it said, "Black boys raised in America, even in the wealthiest families and living in some of the most well-to-do neighborhoods, still earn less in adulthood than white boys with similar backgrounds, according to a sweeping new study that traced the lives of millions of children." And then the write-up goes on to say, white boys who grew up rich stay rich. Black boys who grow up poor are more likely to become poor than to stay wealthy as adults. And they say it's true even if they grow up in the same neighborhood. Mm-hmm. So as humanists, what is your reaction to this study and to this way of paying attention to these phenomena?
Mm-hmm. So my first reaction is the report just affirms what every Black and brown person knows in America by experience, which is that racism is still prevalent. I mean, literally, that's what the report says. And anyone who is a researcher who works on these issues knows that to be true as well. However, in our national conversations, we don't always acknowledge racism as still being prevalent. And the conversation is more likely to shift towards class. And so what's really striking about the report is it really debunks class as being the driver in sort of the economic disparities in America. Because white boys who start at the bottom have a better chance of going up than Black boys who start at the top. The Black boys who start at the top actually have an equal chance of sinking to the very bottom as they do at staying at the top. So the kind of arguments that we've been having about class, remember just the 2008 election, a lot of it was about class. Class is profoundly important, but it's not a substitute for dealing with race and racism. So that's my first response. The second response, and I'll talk specifically about what the report says about marriage, is that and this hasn't really come out in the conversation, but I read the report. It's actually 100 pages long, and I read it. And what it says is that actually it does not matter if children grow up in single-parent households versus married coupled households, if they are African American, in terms of their life outcomes. They still will suffer regardless. So there's very little difference in those households. And so what does that tell us is that there's been all this conversation about marriage from liberals and conservatives, that marriage is the way we can diminish, if not eliminate, poverty. If more African Americans would only marry, if more African Americans would only have children in wedlock and not form single family households, then we would be a long way towards correcting poverty. And this report actually completely knocks that out of the water.
I would add that, again, the report reminds us that when we're talking about marriage, we can't talk only in terms of interpersonal relationships. So the kinds of questions that we have about marriage can't be answered through prescriptive literature about how to prepare some man's meal to make him happier, which I think has been very much part of the kind of social how-to or advice literature as a response, but rather that we do need to think about these kinds of structural issues. I think, for example, some of the recent work, both by kind of political economists and sociologists, have begun to think about how and humanists to some extent, have begun to remind us that we can't look at the outcomes, marital outcomes of single white women and single Black women as being identical because of how they may be drawing from different marriage pools. Particularly, African American women are less less likely than white women to be engaged in interracial relationships. Also, then, if you have a smaller pool of college-educated Black men as possible partners for higher income women, although those aren't the only possible partners, that too is addressing the kind of questions of pools. So I know that some sociologists refer to this as a kind of inequality of love, really, that looking at the intimate life of Black women can often reflect other kinds of inequalities that are going on in terms of race, class, and gender. I think part of your question, too, was about what do we do and how our kind of humanist perspectives on this can happen or can help. And I think that part of my work is very attuned to the language and the stories that we tell around understandings of marriage, knowing, for example, that statistics alone need to stand in for interpretation. And when we then do that interpretation, we have to be mindful of the language that we're using. It comes to mind, for example, a story that or rather an article that I recently saw. The headline was something like, singleness more deadly than obesity for your health. And I opened the link. Of course, everyone who knows I'm writing this book sends me every, New York Times piece that's about single women, right? So I opened the piece, and the piece actually is using singleness as a shorthand for loneliness. So it's partly about elderly people who are living alone. Now, from my literature and language perspective, I want to trouble something like that because it assumes that singleness is loneliness. And even if the issue is that living alone leads one to be lonely, then marriage isn't the only answer to living alone. There are other kinds of residential ways that people can share their lives, but that also means that we'd have to change some other expectations. So it's also problematic that when we see two people living together as roommates, we say, oh, they need to grow up and get out on their own. That too then works back into the problem, but the only option that you'll have then is to be married. And that doesn't allow for us to really address the ways that individual Americans' lives need to respond to, as I mentioned, these different configurations that might best serve their economic needs, social needs, and so on.
Okay, please join me in thanking Tera Hunter and Andreá Williams for this terrific discussion, and I know that there's questions from the audience. So Brooke Andrade, the director of the library, is going to come around. She has a microphone because otherwise we can't hear you. We're recording tonight, and I'll try to help her find you if you raise your hand.
Maybe I don't want to use this. So Tera, this is a question out of pure ignorance, but if, I was very interested to hear from you that the labor pool, but the availability of work for Blacks declined precipitously after World War II. So could you give us a 2-minute take on up to World War II and because that goes against what I would have thought, that's all.
Well, I mean, what's happening at mid-century is, well, part of it has to do with migration, right? So African Americans are primarily rural Southerners, after slavery ends, during slavery and then after slavery ends. And they start to shift to the north during the period of World War I. That's the first Great Migration, and then the period of World War II with the second Great Migration. The problem with that shift from the rural South to the northern industrial areas is that they're coming into the economy at sort of a late point in economic development. And so they're not coming in at an optimal point in terms of getting, the best positions and so on. And so that they're at a disadvantage. And so that puts them at a disadvantage when the industrial economy starts to decline. And so that's why they're essentially getting, when downsizing happens, when jobs are shipped, abroad, when all of those economic things happen that we really still haven't recovered from, and the economy then becomes more of a service economy as opposed to an industrial economy. African-American men especially suffer, women as well, but African-American men especially suffer. And then they're not sort of favored in the new economy that emerges. So a large number of men then find themselves out of work. And unfortunately, that number has not petered off. It's grown. And then, as I said, there is underemployment in terms of those who can find work. They're not finding the work, for example, that was a good paying job as a person with a high school education. You moved to Detroit and you got a good job at the auto plant. Those jobs are no more. And so they're, working in the service industry where they're getting paid, minimum wage or not much more than minimum wage. That's really what becomes a problem.
Thank you both very much for the presentations. And I want to say that I am a proud alum of Bennett College. And my question is to Andrea. Could you tell me, please, what the archives of Bennett College, what you unearthed regarding singleness?
Okay. One of the things is that Bennett College, like some other HBCUs, including Atlanta University and Clark College, hosted homemakers institutes that were sponsored by the campus, but in collaboration with community sponsors or community people as well. So for example, for some years, they would sponsor a Best Family in the Community award. And I saw that one of the years, the finalist in the kind of 40s or so, one was actually a widowed mother with 2 children, but the other 2 families that were finalists were 2-parent households there. So what's beautiful about the records of that institute that runs for many years is that they have everything from how many people attended, what their average age was. So I can really see how this information may have been disseminated to a number of different people. The body of the speeches of people who came, I could hear all of exactly what happened at many of those conferences, so that's useful. But as I may have mentioned, I've been particularly drawn to the faculty and staff people who staff many of these institutions. So for me, dorm matrons, the language would have been matrons then, we would say now directors as a more professionalized and gender neutral term. But there's something deliberate about dorm matron that I mean, because it really was like being a public mother in that dormitory. And often those were never married women or ever single women whose professional role was to treat other women and teach them how to be mothers, when they themselves often were not. One thing that I love about I've also been looking at Charlotte Hawkins Brown, a 2-time divorcee, that people continue to send their daughters to her and think she is the model of etiquette who should teach our daughters about homeowning. And so, I say kind of jokingly, Charlotte Hawkins Brown was an educator who set up Palmer Memorial Institute in Sedalia, North Carolina, was a private-owned Black school, and she set up kind of president's cottage there, what's called the Canary Cottage. That was her presidential residence. And it was supposed to be for her to have young women and her male students as well to come in and see, this is how you sit the table for tea, and these are your good manners to use in your household with your family. But I, as a young woman, might be walking through there like, she didn't have a man. She didn't have any children, and this is a nice house. So, maybe I could do that too. So again, these are the ways that I somewhat read against the grain to say, this is the public face of saying that we're preparing you for marriage, but much of that professional work was done by women who themselves were not married.
Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation, and it's reminding me, of course, of all the wonderful conversations we've been having all year. So a few weeks ago, you probably noticed there was an op-ed in the Times about the let's stop blaming women who are unmarried and have children. It was written by sociologists, one from Australia, looking at the data in the United States and comparing it to data from other developed countries. and concluding that it's not only single mothers, but also people on disability, people without degrees, and concluding that, in fact, the real problem is that the penalties for these situations in this country are so high compared to other countries where there is a better social safety net. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on this.
I hadn't read that study in particular, but I do think, again, that part of the concern around single mothers historically has been not only the policing of their sexuality, but the concerns about the way that their economic status might infringe upon the well-being of others around them. And again, that then gives the sense that that nuclear family has to be the one support for child rearing, whereas the kinds of models that I'm suggesting really allow for single people to be part of more integrated models of both community-based and state-based support for families.
I would also say that op-ed also reinforces that, female-headed households in and of themselves are not related to poverty, right? So there are countries that have higher rates of, female-headed households, and they're not poor, precisely for the reason that you stated. They're not penalized. They're actually given support, supporting resources and institutions that actually enable them to have healthy, productive families. So I think that is really critical. In this country, we tend to penalize certain types of families as opposed to providing support for them. So it's not about being single female-headed households. It's about how do we regard those. That really matters.
So obviously I'm kind of new to this, but the poverty and the marriage thing, how did it become so intertwined where we see one as an answer to another? Because that never occurred to me at all, that if some poor woman got married, she'd automatically be less poor. So
That's a good.
Well, I would say part of it is correlation, right? So you see a correlation between single female-headed households, and you see a correlation with the rates of poverty coinciding. And so that's the short answer, is that correlation is interpreted as causation by some people. That's the short answer.
I think, Tera, too, you've pointed out in your work before that there have actually been historical points at which African Americans' marriage rates slightly outpaced white Americans, and that didn't mean that there was any less poverty. Rather, there was this continuing wealth gap among Black and white Americans.
Thanks for reminding me of that. I forgot to mention that. Yes, when I was talking about, 1900. So at the beginning of the 20th century, African Americans are actually, first of all, they're nearly universally married, which means everybody of adult age got married. Right, and they're also marrying slightly more than whites because they're marrying more earlier, and they're marrying earlier, but they're also less likely to never marry or to ever be single. That number is very low. So that is very striking, right? That's a period in which poverty is much higher, right? At the the turn of the 20th century, poverty rates are much higher than they are today. So then how do we say poverty is the reason that marriage rates are low when poverty was at its highest point in American society? African Americans were universally married. So marriage did not keep them from being poor. It did not get them out of being poor. And it's not working in that way today either.
I think that I would add to that too in thinking about single African American women, even for people who, and the studies that suggest that some people don't marry because they don't feel financially ready to be so, and lead us to the kind of economic lack that might, or instability that might pertain to that. There's actually an inverse relationship for Black professional women and their marriageability. So even as their wealth and potential to be married increases on the surface, that doesn't mean that their actual marriage rates do. And so in that case, I think we do have to be careful about the relationships that we're drawing between poverty and the economic state and its impact on marriage.
It's a bunch of questions. There's one back. Sure. Yep.
Thank you both. Love to hear y'all thinking independently and together. This is a question for Tera on the issue of slavery, which you're arguing for Black people doesn't determine marriage rates in the 20th century, and to have that myth there seems to perpetuate kind of cultural stereotypes. But I've been thinking myself about the presence of like the afterlife of slavery, or what law people call the badges of slavery in the 20th century. And in the New York Times today, another article was on the disparity in infant mortality between Black and white babies, which is higher than it has been since it was measured, which is 1850, which is a stunning kind of figure. And the article ended, actual institutional and structural racism has a big bearing on our patients' lives, and it's a responsibility to talk about that more than just saying that it's a problem, says Dr. Sanita L. Williams, an African-American OBGYN in the Bay Area, That's been the missing piece, I think, for a long time in medicine. But clearly there have been these huge missing pieces for a long time all across, or we wouldn't get this 1850 statistic. So I have a question for Tera and one for Tania, but it seems like if you turn the focus to white culture, it's quite appropriate to talk about this continuing legacy of slavery, and that kind of becomes a ghost if we don't look at it. So, but then to Tera, you ask about humanists in these issues, and it seems like if we're going back to 1850, and Roy Moore isn't even president yet, that these effects are so anti-human that it's my assertion, I just wonder if you agree, that we really can't be humanists unless we're explicitly anti-racist. So, unless we're explicitly anti-racist.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think the legacy of slavery is something that we don't talk about in this country, that we need to talk about more. And when we do talk about it, we typically focus on Black people. We talk about the legacy of slavery that Black people carry in this country, as though, and basically, I can't remember now which Supreme Court justice said this, but it was basically said that, well, we're at the point now where we can stop talking about race. Because we've basically, we have, laws against discrimination, so we've basically done our job, and now it's time to move on. And so I think that we haven't moved on, and so we do need to talk about it in terms of, and I think one of the things that the Brookings Institution report pointed out, which we've just been talking about, is the advantages that whites are receiving in this country. So it's not just that we need to look at the disadvantages that African Americans suffer from. We also need to look at what are the advantages, and then how do we actually go about creating a society in which people actually have opportunities that aren't based on their race, because right now that's still prevalent.
Thank you. After the Emancipation Proclamation, I can only imagine that the households were matriarchal controlled. How did that change, and if it did change, was there a lot of friction in the changing of who was the head of household?
Well, I would say they weren't matriarchal. I would say that there was a very diverse form of marriages under slavery. I would say there's some that I would call matrifocal, meaning that they were mother-centered. And that was usually because they were separated. So usually mothers and children were kept together, men were kept apart. But what's interesting is that most children grew up knowing their fathers under slavery. The problem was that most did not live with them throughout their entire lives. So usually at some point in a child's life, they would be separated from their fathers. So there's a very diverse array of family forms. Marriage was very prevalent. So it was up to the masters to decide if they would allow their slaves to marry or not, and most did, even for their own advantages in terms of creating stability and so on. After slavery ends, African Americans mostly moved towards legalizing their relationships, legalizing their marriages. And so, again, but you still see a diversity of forms. You see, mothers and fathers are being united with their children, so they're more two-parent households after slavery ends. I would not call them matriarchal. There is certainly tension about whether they're going to be patriarchal or not, because women are also resistant to leaving slavery and then becoming subjected to husband's authority. So that's what I would say.
Okay, please join me again in thanking Tera Hunter and Andreá Williams. And we have a reception in the back. If you have other questions, they will be there, and please stick around. Thank you.